Good morning, Dan. Welcome back from Florida. How was your trip?
No, the trip was great. Thanks for asking. I'm a lot more fortunate than I deserve. Florida's got some very beautiful parts.
Sure, sure. It has its charms, right? All right. Well, what are we talking about today?
I want to talk about teaching your children about money and wealth, saving for your children's future, whether that's college or another endeavor, and defining success in more ways than just dollars.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. All right, talking about the next generation, right? What does it mean to raise a family and create a legacy, and make the world a better place for the next generation? What a terrific set of topics. So I guess hit me. What do we want to talk about first here?
I want to talk about teaching your children about wealth. This is a topic we've brushed upon before, and we've broken it down into really two different categories, I guess. One is just things your children may pick up. So they watch you and your habits and actions and behaviors with money and your relationship with money, and they develop a set of behaviors and habits themselves. But additionally, there's just implicit things we can teach them. The value of money, how to do the marshmallow test and defer gratitude to later dates. And I wanted to talk about both of those a little bit. Some of the squishier things that people may pick up, but also actual things, intangible things that are appropriate to speak with your children about.
Mm. So let's use some real world stuff to sort of model this. So let me ask you a question, Daniel. What was your first memory of money?
My first memory of money is probably with my father. My father's a big, buy value over the price of something. So he's willing to quote unquote overspend if it's something that will last a while, but is more expensive up front. And I remember I've been a skier my entire life. We went to the North Face outlet by my house, and there was a jacket, and I was young that I don't know the price exactly, but I remember he hem and hawed about the price, and he was like, "Look, this is an expensive jacket, but you're going to take care of it, and it's going to take care of you. And as long as you don't grow a foot in the next year, it's still going to fit, and it's going to serve not only you, but my brother, who's a little younger and was a little smaller, for upwards of 4 to 5 years." And I remember we had that jacket. It's a blue North Face ski jacket. I had it for maybe 2 years, then gave it to my brother who had it for 2 years. And then we actually gave it to our neighbor across the street who I believe had it for 2 years. And then he passed it on to somebody else who I didn't know. But long story short, what was considered an expensive jacket ended up lasting almost a decade for multiple young children. And I remember my dad drilling into us buying a value over the price of something because you want to buy quality.
Hmm. So that's a conscious money lesson, right? That's your dad deliberately teaching you the importance of value, right? Not just going for the best deal or for the cheapest thing or trying not to spend money, but really conscientiously going out of his way to emphasize that to you. Now, in turn, I imagine both you and pretty much anybody who's listening to this also picked up a lot of lessons that were maybe unintentional. Do you have a money memory for maybe a lesson that your parents weren't consciously trying to give you?
My parents got divorced when I was in elementary school. And whether they realize it or not, they both handle finances very differently. My dad's more frugal and aware of some of these purchases and how much he spends and saves. My mom tends to be a little bit more toward the other end of the spectrum, where she's just happy to be, living and enjoying day to day, and doesn't really think about automating savings or budgeting and whatnot. And I think just observing the dichotomy between how the two of them handled money was something that they may not have realized they were teaching me. But it gave me a very unique perspective because I watched both of them handle things considerably differently, stress around money and handling of certain purchases. And I'd say I probably implicitly picked up, maybe some things that I do want to do whether it's being frugal but not cheap, but also not stressing about money maybe more than is necessary because I see what that could do to somebody.
Sure. I think the interesting, experience there, right? You had a very conscious, deliberate lesson taught, and it was sort of a small thing. We're just making a purchase today. And in turn, you have these very important unintentional lessons that are just environmental. I'm observing what my parents are doing, I'm observing what's happening to them. So, the sort of presiding theory of how people gain an understanding of wealth and money and kind of establish money values really comes from what in current research literature is called family financial socialization. That your money experiences and your beliefs about money are formed by intentional lessons from your family, unintentional lessons from your family, and then the third part is community. Right? What do your peers do? Are you one of the rich kids? Are you one of the poor kids? Do you have a friend whose family is really well off? They always have nice stuff. Are you the rich kid? Do your friends never seem to do as well as you? What lessons do you learn from the fact that it seems like Santa always brings the rich kids really nice stuff and doesn't really seem to give the poor kids that much at Christmas? So there's a lot of things to really think about here, and the interesting trick is most, I think, parents try to impart valuable money lessons deliberately on their children, but those are really finite, specific events that you put weight on because you're doing it deliberately. The secret is for a lot of parents, they're going to teach their kids a lot more about money through their day to day behavior than they are through deliberate life lesson moments. And so that's sort of an interesting thing because most parents recognize that they are not perfect with money, or that their family isn't perfect with money, or that they haven't always been perfect with money. And I think it becomes a big point of financial anxiety for a lot of parents and a lot of families that they're going to impart good lessons or unintentionally impart bad lessons onto their children. And I think you'd be surprised, well, you wouldn't, Daniel, but anybody listening would be surprised at how much time we often spend talking to clients about their kids and about what their money is doing to their kids, or what inheritances and gifts their kids have done, or how they're spending them and how they're using them. It's a fascinating subject because you'd think it'd be something you could really just drill in, right? A penny saved is a penny, or so on and so forth. Excuse me. But it's sort of a fascinating area because despite all good intentions or lack of intentions, we're going to teach our kids a lot about money as they grow up, whether we like it or not.
How does the level of wealth a certain family accrues play into this? A wealthy family may teach different things inherently, and uh, than a family that's not of decent means. How does the level of wealth play into that? And are there certain things that are taught differently depending on the net worth and wealth level?
I don't think there's any established boundaries. You see these little lists where something to be like, what poor people think, what middle class people think, what upper class people think, and it'll have things like money. For poor people, money is to be spent. For rich people, money is to be invested. For middle class people, money is to be saved. I think those are all sort of platitudes. I think those are all really just biased statements of people's general perspective. The example I always think about is actually Warren Buffett's kids. Warren Buffett's kids did not know he was one of the richest men on earth, or literally the best investor of all time, until they were adults. Like they had no idea. In fact, there was a story about one of the kids having to put, like, what do your parents do for a living, like on a school form or something, and the kid put like security guard on his parents' form because his dad was a securities analyst. It's like there's stuff like that where we can think of like, oh, of course, like rich people are going to really, spend a lot of time and energy imparting important money lessons on their kids, and poor people don't have the skills. That's not really what happens in practice. The average American is financially illiterate. It's less than 35% of the population can pass a financial literacy test. And even those who can pass a literacy test may not be proportionally literate, right? They might be like really good with debt and investing, but they may know nothing about insurance. So all of that to say, I think wealth really has more of a lesson impact on both the scale of financial decisions that you sort of teach your children about, right? Like if you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to teach your kids about having a lot of money problems. But in turn, I think more so the biggest thing that wealth really does to impart lessons on children is how ostentatious or how freely wealth is treated, or how constrictively and controlled wealth is treated within a household. right? Is money a thing that, the patriarch or the matriarch of the family absolutely, controls with an iron fist, and anytime we want or need money, we have to have a conversation about it? Or do we get to just, be a co account holder on our parents' credit card, and we can spend whatever they want, and we're definitely going to get a Lexus when we turn 16? Like, I think there's very different lessons that are imparted in those environments outside of those that are deliberately taught.
You brought up something that raised a question for me there. And this is a squishy topic, so there's no right or wrong, so I'm careful in how I phrase it. But uh, is there a level of sharing that you think is appropriate? There's a specific family I have in mind that I know they speak with their children and say, "Oh yeah, I want you to inherit blank, blank, and blank when I die." And then we work with families on both ends of those spectrum, some of which say, "I don't want my kids to know anything about how much money I have."
I think playing it too close to the chest is a problem, and I think oversharing is a problem, and for very different reasons. I think playing it too close to the chest is not so much of a problem when your kids are young. Like, your kids don't need to know what you make, your kids don't need to know how much you have saved, etc. But like, there's things about, like, are we going to pay for your college? Are you going to pay for your college? Are we going to help you with college? That's important. That really should affect a child's behavior, particularly as you're getting close to a going to college age. Conversely, as you get older, as your kids get older, you do need to sort of open the kimono a little bit, because to some extent, right, if you live long enough, through no fault of your own, some warranties are going to expire. And one day your kids are going to be involved in your financial decisions, whether you like it or not, or whether you planned on it or not. Now, plenty of people pass away young enough that it's not a problem. But if you live long enough, you're going to need some assistance, or you're going to have mental decline risks. And so your kids are going to get involved in it. And it shouldn't be a surprise by the time that happens. You really need to be a little bit more open and forthright about it, particularly because a lot of parents, I think, have some shame around their finances. It's not uncommon for us to talk to folks approaching retirement, in retirement, who find themselves in a position where they're going, I just didn't do things as well as I could have, and I'm a little embarrassed to discuss it. Turns out almost nobody has ever done their finances perfectly in their life. And so that's a personal feeling, but it's important to overcome. On the other side of the spectrum, though, for the oversharing thing, I think that can be really damaging, sort of at different phases of life. I think it can be really damaging for young kids to overshare on finances, particularly because you can really learn a very different message from something like scarcity, right? So some families, particularly families that don't have a lot of money, may just point blank tell their kids early on, like, we're poor, we don't have money, right? And they'll say things like, we can't afford that, right? Or that's not something that we can buy. We can't do that. You can't do that because of money. And the challenge there is you can impart really different, long lasting financial traumas on your kids by communicating that sort of thing too early. When you say things like, we can't afford that, that might teach the kid anything from, we can't afford that because if we don't spend our money on something else, it'll disappear. So then we can't afford it because we spend our money all the time. And it might teach that same kid a completely different lesson, which is, we don't have money because we spend it. Therefore, what I should learn from this is I should never spend money, because if I spend money, I won't have money. And therefore, even when I have an abundance of wealth later in life, I can't enjoy it because I'm scared subconsciously that I'm going to lose it and not have it again. So it's really important to balance how much you share and don't share. I think a really good book on this subject is The Opposite of Spoiled. I believe it's by Ron Lieber. But it's a really good explanation on, like, look, there are valuable sort of age appropriate lessons to deliberately teach about money, and there's things that you really shouldn't be communicating about money at certain ages with your kids.
I find it super interesting how, we can be 40, 50 years old and still have feelings about money that we picked up as children. How much of the responsibility, or how much would you say of the way I interpret money or somebody else may interpret money, comes from, their family versus how much they just pick up themselves through knowledge and taking responsibility? You love to say nobody's coming to save you, but at the same time, if your parents are, when you're younger, teaching you certain things, it might be very difficult for you to recognize or even get rid of those feelings about wealth even as you age.
Yeah, and I think that's also an important thing is we need to bifurcate financial knowledge and financial literacy from financial beliefs. So we have a term in research and in kind of the literature of money scripts. Money scripts include things like money worship, right? Being really overemphasizing about consumption of money, or money focus, where you are just sort of obsessed with accumulating money, but not necessarily using it. Money is sort of to keep score, or money avoidance, right? That you shouldn't have money, or having money makes you a bad person, or if you have money, you should be giving it away and using it for other people, right? Or money vigilance. If I have to be very careful about how I spend money, it's a precious resource, and sometimes it's too precious of a resource for my own good. Like these are money scripts, these are money beliefs, and that's different necessarily than what we impart. So your question there, I think you gain almost all of your money beliefs from your family. That's where we get back into the theory of family financial socialization. I think financial knowledge and financial literacy, you almost have to want to learn it outside of your family instead of from your family, because back to the financial literacy problem, where less than 35% of the population is financially literate. Despite best intentions, your parents may have no idea what they're talking about. And so, if they're trying to deliberately teach you about saving or investing, that can be a really big problem. You and I know somebody whose family is essentially obsessed with one very specific type of asset, and you and I both know that type of asset is not really that great of an investment asset. But lo and behold, that entire family essentially only buys, only invests, only holds that asset. And you and I know as substantially financially literate people that asset is perfectly fine to have, but it shouldn't be all of your wealth. But for anybody who grew up in that family, they're going to have just that asset, only that asset, and it takes a lot of work to convince them otherwise that anything else is worth having. And that's an example where that family or members of that family have been financially successful despite the emphasis of that asset, whereas other folks in the family are essentially much poorer than they should be because that's all they've done, but they haven't done anything else or never learned anything else.
I think that's great, breaking the financial beliefs versus the financial literacy aspects of it. So going off that a little bit, one of the things you can do to provide for your children is paying for higher education. Uh, whether that's paying for college, or maybe you don't believe in college, or you don't believe college is for the child. I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about this in two different ways. The first is, if you have the means to pay for this higher education or expense but choose not to, but also just speaking about paying for college versus alternatives to college and how to go about that as well.
Yeah, so since we're going to focus on college here, let me sort of list out a number of options on a spectrum of for them all the way back to for you. And when I say that, I'm emphasizing where the primary benefit of the strategy lies. So the first option is not actually a college savings plan, but the most for them option is going to be a UTMA or a UGMA account, which is a uniform transfer to minors account. The UTMA, UGMA just depends on the state that you're in. It's uniform gift to minors in the few states. But in those accounts, you are making an irrevocable gift into an account for the benefit of a child. And when they reach the age of majority, depending on their state laws and statutes, that account will become theirs, regardless of whether you think it should be theirs, regardless of whether you think they're a good person or they're ready for it. It's theirs. So I say that's the most for them because it's an irrevocable gift you're making to your children that also they can use however they want. Right. So for a parent who has a very independence minded mindset, like I'm just going to give my kid $50,000 when they graduate high school and they're on their own, that's sort of the kind of account where that's kind of the ideal application. Now, taking a step back towards for you, the next option is going to be a college savings account. It's going to be a 529. And the reason we emphasize a 529 here is because it's sort of the strongest college savings vehicle. State by state, you may have to use your state's plan, or it may not make any difference whether you use your state's plan, but all 50 states have one or several 529 plan types available. And the reason I say it's more for you is because you are specifically focusing the savings goal and objective on sort of college, which there's kind of a social contract that parents are involved in college, even if they don't intend to be. Or like even if you say I'm not paying for your college kid, you're still going to be required to do FAFSA, financial aid stuff, cosign things, etc. So you're sort of pre-funding an expense that might otherwise fall upon you, but also in certain states you get a tax advantage for funding the account. And so again, there's just a little bit more of a personal benefit. Now, if we take another step down that continuum, our next stop is probably just a brokerage account that doesn't belong to the kid. It's just mom and dad's accounts, and they're going to invest in it, and it's for them. And so, if the kid is not ready to go to college, isn't right for college, shouldn't go to college, whatever it is, you don't have to give it to them. It's your money. You're really just investing for yourself, but you have the option to use it for their college or for something else. And then I think finally, it's actually just going all the way back into retirement accounts for yourself. Because then, once again, you derive almost all the primary benefits, but there's certain allowances from certain types of retirement accounts, either to take principal out without penalties or to spend some of the balance on college expenses, for the benefit of one of your kids, and so on.
Okay, and we work with a lot of families who, in some degree, want to fund education for their children. However, we also speak with some people who say, "I didn't pay for my college. I worked my butt off to pay off the student loans or whatever the case may be, get scholarships, and I want them to do the same." Not that there's a right or wrong answer, but if somebody does have the ability to, within some degree, provide this opportunity for their children, how do we start to navigate that choice with clients and think about doing it, if they've raised their child the right way to value money, if they can fund it?
Ooh, let's actually be careful about that too, because you just used a very particular phrase, which is raise their child the right way to value money. Let's be careful about that. That's a value statement. That is not actually an objective fact. So I'm throwing that out there just because I want to point out how easily that kind of language slips in. So with that in mind, though, when we think about whether we should, right, should we pay for our kids' college, should we not? I am well past the point of having any judgments about it in terms of like what I'll advise a client. We have clients who are on as far opposite ends of the spectrum as possible. We have clients who would want to be able to pay for their kids to go to Harvard. And we have clients who are very wealthy who are like, nope, my kid's on their own. They'll figure it out. And then there's plenty of people in the middle who can't really afford to pay for their kids' college, but they feel obligated to. And conversely, a lot of folks who certainly could help their kid, but like don't really feel like putting in the effort or the work or don't really want to give them that much. Um, I sort of take, as a recommendation or best practice, I do sort of take the oxygen mask theory for this, the whole, put your mask on before you help others. I don't recommend that parents, sacrifice their futures for their children in that sense. I don't think it's a very good idea for a parent who is in their 40s or 50s or 60s to take out enormous loans or stop funding their own retirement or sell their assets to be able to pay for their kids' college. And there's a lot of values around paying for kids' college, both personal and cultural. So I don't say that lightly because there's some people who listen to this who are like, sorry, no, I would cut off my own legs and donate both of my kidneys before I didn't pay for my kids' college. But what I'm saying here is, you can't be of help to your children if you become a financial burden to them through decisions you make for their benefit. We have a huge amount of financial aid. We have student loans. We have federal, state programs and grants, scholarships, and even worst case scenario, private student loans. And those can all become burdens on children. My wife's family, essentially nobody had any money from the family to pay for college. They all had to go get scholarships. They all had to get great grades and go to good schools of their own volition and from their own effort. And the consequences, some of them have some pretty substantial student debt. And that's a problem that they, as adults, constructively deal with. But in turn, right, if your family has the affluence and has the means to really support this, ask the question, what good are you doing for your family by making them suffer unnecessarily or struggle unnecessarily? I think that's a really interesting question because there's lots of life lessons gained from adversity and from struggle and from challenge. There's a whole thing about having some skin in the game, really learning life lessons, having to work your way through school and what that does for your work ethic and so on. So I think there's a healthy balance to strike between like the I pay for my kids' college and I pay for them to go to Cabo every spring break and party it up and they can fail as much as they want because I'll support them. I think there's a line to draw before you reach that point. But on the other side, if you have the means and your disposition is like, they'll figure it out, I would really challenge you to think a little bit harder about that in those situations, because hardship can be generational, and also it's just money. And depending on how much hardship you're placing on your kids, is it worth damaging your relationship with them or causing them lifelong financial trauma, stress, and other anxieties or disorders just to make a point about self-reliance?
I have a fun question for you based on that. What if you have two children? You saved up a sum for them each, but one is a straight A student, does everything right, yet the other one, kind of gets by or maybe doesn't take advantage of the opportunities that they've been provided with. Do you take that into consideration when provide them with these funds for higher education?
I think this is where you get into a conversation about equal versus equitable. Because we could say that it's even more unfair than that. Like one is a straight A student, one kind of gets by, and one is incredibly smart, and one is, God bless him, dumb as a bag of bricks. And like genetics has played a role here, and just whatever it is. I think that's much more of a family conversation than a prescriptive conversation, because we've also seen equitable go very different directions, right? We have a client who has two children, and you might as well only think they have one child because the other one never comes up. They never want to talk about them, and that kid is not getting anything when the parents pass away. And conversely, right, there's some families who are like, hey, my straight A students scholarships just became our B minus students extra college funds, right? Because we're just going to go ahead and make sure they all get to the same place. We're going to focus on the outcomes rather than the inputs there. And is that fair? No, but life's full of unfairness. I think at the end of the day, it's really just about what can you afford to give, what can you afford to support, and in turn, what is the outcome you're attempting to accomplish through the financial decisions you're making on your kid's behalf.
Okay, so going off that, maybe your child is 8, 10 years old, and you're starting to recognize maybe college isn't for them. They have interests outside of traditional education, maybe it's a trade, or as you said, maybe they just didn't get the luck of the draw and their brains aren't all there. If you want to still provide them with an opportunity that most likely won't be higher education, or maybe is a coin flip, how do you navigate starting to save for that if it's not likely to be the traditional college route?
I think you hedge your bets. I think that's where sort of the individual brokerage or joint brokerage account strategy versus the college fund or versus the UTMA makes more sense, because you're reserving the opportunity or the choice to go ahead and say, look, I'm going to save, I'm going to provide financial means here, but I'm going to hedge the decision. There's also a million and one stories like brilliant savant type kids who are really talented and smart, just going absolutely off the rails at the last possible second. So I mean that is probably, if there's anything hard about being a parent, and there's a lot of stuff that's hard about being a parent, it's probably got to be that despite all your best efforts, you do not control the outcome. And so that's where I do think it's okay to hedge the bets there. I'm just a little bit more bearish on the idea that you're just going to be like, yeah, my kids will figure it out.
I like that. So maybe, not putting all your eggs in one basket and weighing or investing, different weights into separate accounts.
Sure. And here's a hypothetical you haven't asked, but I'll throw it back on you just to hear how you think about this. Let's say you have kids who are perfectly, reasonably talented, smart, whatever the case is, and one wants to go, pre med or pre law or be an engineer or something where you really approve of what they're going to do with it, and the other one wants to study like Greek poetry. How would you approach that?
Carefully.
So
It's a good question though, and being 24 and not having children, I'm fortunate that I, even if I had kids today, wouldn't have to deal with that for a decade or two. But that's one of those things. It's like, what do we want for our children? It's really to be safe, healthy and happy. And we've had this conversation before. It's pursuing something that's practical, that you're good at, that also probably will pay you enough to support your lifestyle. And I think if it's something that fits within those three categories, I'd be happy, if they pursued it. But if it fell off in one of those areas where, maybe it didn't pay very well or they weren't very good at it or something, then I think we'd have to have a deeper conversation. And for this, I'm referring more to the Greek literature as opposed to the law student. But if I had the financial means to pay for both, and they went those separate ways, I think I'd be happy, yeah, having those conversations and supporting them.
yeah, and I think it's very respectable of you, and I think a lot of parents think about it that way. I admit I find myself personally in the camp of college is a educational investment, and so if the ROI on the investment isn't strong, we shouldn't make the investment. So I'm not big on the music for deaf people degree or the painting for blind people degree or anything like that. And that, that's a little bit judgmental of me in the sense that I always think about it in very practical terms. But I'm also just very cognizant of how much money gets wasted on poorly spent educations, where I do really think of college as a trade school, and that very much flouts the high minded ideals of having a well rounded education and being a just more educated person in general. But for how much money college costs in a lot of cases, and for how little return there is in certain places, like my undergrad degrees are history and poli sci, and I can tell you, having had those degrees, I could have just read the books and not gotten the degrees in history and poli sci. But in turn, right, I really enjoyed it, and it was I had a plan and a vision behind it at the time. But I think that's the thing to be really cognizant of. There's a lot of educational money that is misspent. And it's, I think, important to be judicious about how it's deployed and whether an investment in education is for life stage satisfaction. Everybody in my family goes to college thinking, or is it to produce a tangible and practical outcome that will benefit us in the future?
You also just happen to be rather pragmatic, so your take doesn't tend to surprise me there.
I know. My utilitarian roots really bleed through on this topic.
Well, let's wrap it up here. Uh, Final topic, I want to talk about defining success in more than just dollars. And there was a little tweet I saw the other day that said, uh, success is getting what you want out of life. Essentially, it's if you have achieved the things that you seek out to achieve. And it's interesting because I think there's two different ways to think about it. The first is, okay, well, some people look at life and they say, I want to be healthy, happy. I want my kids to be happy. And if I have all those things and I can, have a house to call my own and food on the table and maybe a vacation a year, I'm happy. But then there's other people who they want more. They play the game for the materials, whether it's the second house, the third house, the luxury car. And I think it raises an interesting thought because, for some people, it's easier to simply want for less, but others they want and they're happy to put the time and effort in to achieve those things they want. And I'm not sure which is easier or which is better per se, but I think it raises the question of like, what does success look like, and why is it so different for so many people?
Mm. It's interesting, right? Because as a financial podcast, as financial planners, et cetera, money is the marker of success, is sort of a common de facto position. More money good, less money bad. We spend a lot of time training clients to get out of that mindset, and we even do it when we present it. We say, look, we're going to turn on these decisions and turn on these changes and these options, and you're going to see the bars go up when it creates more money. You're going to see the bars go down when there's less money, and that might trick you into thinking that the good financial decisions are the one that create more bars, and bad financial decisions are the one that reduce bars. But we always return to this framing of money as permission, right? And so do you want to die with X million dollars, or do you want to die with enough and have had a better quality of life, provided a better quality of life for your family, had better experiences, so on and so forth? And I think when you expand that thinking to the rest of life, some of the happiest people on earth have nothing, like in just an economic sense. And meantime, there are plenty of absolutely miserable rich bastards out there. So, I mean, in that particular context, I think it's important to have a judicious approach to building wealth, accumulating wealth, etc. But I don't think there's any magical number that's ever going to make somebody happy. And the research is also super clear on this, right? When you survey people about like what would it mean to be rich, everybody is always just looking, 60% above where they are today, right? If I had $1 million, I'd be rich. You ask somebody who has $1 million, what would it be to be rich? I need to have like $2-3 million to be rich. You talk to somebody who has $5 million, what would it mean to be rich? Having 10, 15, I feel like I'd be rich. On and on and on. I bet if you could get Elon Musk down in a room and say like, what would it mean to be rich? He'd be like, I think if I had $1 trillion, I'd be rich.
It's funny because when I was in Florida, we went to a very, very nice hotel. The kind of place where I feel uncomfortable, in my sweater and slacks compared to people who I know are wearing, $100,000 suits kind of place. But it was nice just to, observe and people watch. But you hear all these different people. And one of the main themes I got from a lot of my people watching observations was comparison. It was, Joe and James talking about Chris in the corner, who is more wealthy than them and, what they aspire to be. And then you hear other people talk about other people who are even wealthier, and it seems to just continue and continue. I think part of that is just natural. It's human beings, that's how we kind of signal who we are and what we're doing. But at the same time, I think it's hard to turn it off. I'm going to push back a little bit. You said there's a lot of people who are super happy that, don't want for much and are able to kind of turn that off. But you could probably make the argument there's also a lot of people who don't have much who are fairly miserable. And, there's probably a lot of people who are very wealthy and very miserable, but I'd assume there's probably a lot of wealthy people who are also, fairly happy where they are and can turn off that comparison switch as well. Is it really, just that easy as try to want for less and, put your blinders on?
I don't think it's want for less so much as it is that comparison's the thief of joy, as that expression goes. I think it's okay to have objectives and goals to want to strive for that, and it's okay for your goalpost to move a little bit. But I think if the goalpost is moving, you should be able to articulate an internal reason, right? This is for me, or I had another child and now I want to be able to pay for their school and give them a good life, or my career is I want to do something else and that's going to require financial decisions or that sort of thing. I think that's what matters. But if you're just like looking at your neighbor being like, huh, I think Rick is kind of dumb, but he drives a really nice car. I feel like I should have just as nice a car as Rick, if not more. That's the sort of thing where you kind of got to take a step back and say, like, what am I doing this for? Right? Keeping up with the Joneses is absolutely a pointless behavior. But in turn, I think it's okay to have ambitions that require more of you, so long as you take the time to really think about why you want those things.
Okay, and there's an interesting thing here too. There's some people who, and maybe this is the live to work, work to live conversation, but there's some people who, they clock in, clock out. They have interests outside of work and they're comfortable, with the life they have. There's other people who say, look, I'm going to work my butt off for 5 years and make a certain amount so I can do XYZ. Is that kind of what you're referring to here?
I think that sort of behavior is fine, but I think as we've discussed before, I'm a little critical of something like the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, not because of the FI part of that, but because of the RE part to that. Because what I'd suggest is whether it's something you do for a living or not, life is full of rich opportunities to have and find meaning. And I think if the way you find meaning is getting out of working as soon as humanly possible, and then just like playing video games the rest of your life, I hope you find meaning in the video games, but I think there's a lot more you can do and a lot more impact you can make on the world without just solely focusing on the financial aspects of the decisions you make.
Well said. I have a family friend who runs a construction company, to be vague, and he's done very, very well in his respective career, and his family is better off for it. But if you talk to him, I think he's around 50 now. He says that from the time I was 25 to 35, I had so much stress. I had occasional heart issues and health issues, but now I'm 50. Things have worked out well, and I would do it. I'd do it again because look where I am now. But I think it's easy for him to say something like that in hindsight. Like, is that where you kind of draw the line and say, okay, that might be bordering on unreasonable, and there's maybe a lot of luck that played into something like that for you?
I mean, absolutely, because I've been asked the similar question, right? Would you have started a practice and done what you've done and so on, knowing how it worked out? And like knowing how it worked out, sure, but if it was just like, hey, do you want to do it again and try it again, and it's going to be different, whether it could or couldn't work out again? No, because I now know better. I know there are better paths in terms of career and work life balance and satisfaction and so on. So I think knowing the outcome is a bit of a cheat in that regard. So I think if it's I do it all over again, but essentially I've got to redo it, then I think that's a very different decision matrix than I know it's going to work out. So knowing that it's going to work out, would I do it again?
Excellent. For those that listen to other financial planning podcasts, the Michael Kitces is a big name. Say he's a blogger, thought leader, very large terms for the man. Does a lot for the community. But at the end of one of his podcasts, Dan, he asks the guest, "What does success mean to you?" So I'm going to ask that question to you. What would you say success means to you?
Ooh, see that's a totally different podcast. Sorry, I'm gonna disappoint you there.
Fair enough. Fine.
I was say I don't think we've had the predicate conversation to discuss that in that particular regard. It's not to say I won't ever answer that question for you, but I don't think the conversation we've had here today is the right conversation to have to ask that question. Although I can understand why you might think it would be.
Fair enough.
But with that in mind, I think that probably gives me my cue to go ahead and ask you my favorite question, which is Daniel. You've been in Florida recently, but you've also been working on your CFP studies and working with clients and building plans. You built some beautiful plans the last couple of weeks. I'll just say, from like a technical art standpoint, some really phenomenal financial plans in just the last couple of weeks. What have you learned that you think the audience should know?
I have a habit of doing this thing where I say like, "Oh, I was doing this the other day," and the other day could very well be 8 months ago. And I realized that I was having this conversation with my girlfriend in Florida, and we've been together for almost half a decade at this point. And I said something like, "Oh yeah, this happened like a year ago," and we kind of realized it was something that happened when I was 18 years old. So that was 6+ years ago. And we started talking about how we think we've both changed in the last 6 or so years that we've actually known each other. And one of the things was, I've become considerably more patient, I think. And part of that is because I think I've started to internalize, whether it's building wealth, watching her go through medical school, me studying for my CFP, things that are worth doing and things that are really great to pursue take a lot of time. And building wealth is one of those things. We all want to be millionaires today, but you have to put the plan in place today and be very patient. You have to be very aggressive in the short term. What can I do today on a day-to-day basis to achieve this outcome, with the recognition and understanding you might not see any results for a year to 4 years to 10 years, depending on what the goal is. And I think I've gotten more comfortable in that regard doing that compared that to the age of 18, where I was wildly impatient and I wanted everything now. And I wanted to be, I wanted to, be at the seat of the table, but I also wanted to have, the place in the woods. I wanted to be, the smartest person, but also the quietest and most reserved. I wanted it all. And I think I've become more patient in understanding that if you do want certain things, there's trade-offs and other things you won't be able to have, but also that things that are worth pursuing do take considerable effort and both time.
As I don't recall who said it, but I've always liked the observation: life is short, but it's the longest thing you're going to do.
Well said. Thanks, Dan.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.